Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here this afternoon to really talk about Africa and the power of inclusivity in this continent, which has so much opportunity. I think as I start my presentation today, I want to start first by giving a few numbers or sharing Africa in numbers. And when we talk about Africa in numbers, let me start with the macro facts and the demographics. We're 1.4 billion in population, which is about 17% of the world's total. But what is even more interesting about that number and that population is that 40% of the population in Africa is aged 15 years or younger, which is approximately 2 times what the global average stands at. And then we look at this big shift. People talk, and one of the big factors that people always speak to when they speak to Africa is the divide between urbanization and non-urbanization. And we currently have now about a 47% urbanization rate, which means we're about 57% of the global average. And what are the bigger challenges that we face, just like the rest of the world, is we have a lot of unemployment, 7.7% of unemployment, especially when you speak of sub-Saharan Africa, which is against a 6.2% global average when we look at the numbers in 2021. But what about our economic indicators? If we look at the big ones that I speak to, standing here in Luxembourg now, we are a continent where our GDP per capita is $1,645 per person, as compared to a global average of $12,262. So we're just a little over a tenth of the GDP or a tenth of the global GDP. But what is a number which I'm going to point to now, when you look at the number I have on the screen there, that as a continent, our global debt right now is about 702 billion, which is almost the same number of mobile transactions in 2021 in the country. A fantastic coincidence. And then I'll talk to the fives. When I continue to talk numbers before I share my story, let's talk about the fives. 500 million, just about a little under 500 million unique mobile users in the continent, and almost the same amount of people who we aim to be using e-commerce by the year 2025. Some other big opportunities that we have, we have said that in that number, we are an average where we have 16 plus countries, unique people, and of course this big opportunity of the Africa Free Trade Agreement. And finally, the last point which I shared is that 40% of our productivity usually comes from unemployment. So what does all this mean? What are we then saying when we speak about Africa and the opportunities? So when we say that connection for us is key, and the ability to access, adapt, create knowledge using information and communication technologies, it is absolutely fundamental if we're to have social inclusion. Now, what you find that the onset of the pandemic did a number of things, yeah? It allowed a lot of people to work from home. It suddenly allowed a lot of people to recognize the power of technology and what you need. It actually started to be woven right at the heart of the society and everyday activities that we do. So from schooling, I mean, we were battling, people battle with school books, school and everything, and then suddenly the pandemic came up and all schools had to become virtual. How do you do that? Socializing became virtual. People started doing social parties. entertainment, communications, and this big space called commerce. I always share the personal example that for me, I was never a believer in online shopping, and I'm a big shopper. I mean, everybody, if you know me, you'd know that I love, you're very woman. Shop, 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 shoes, clothes, etc. But if there's something I believed in online, no. Because I have to try it, I have to see it, I like the lights, I like everything. Enter pandemic, COVID-19 and all those things, and suddenly we didn't have a choice. And when I look at a country like ours, the number of businesses that grew, e-commerce, not big-time platforms, on a platform that anybody in Africa believes in called WhatsApp, everything started being sold through WhatsApp. The technology that supported that was that deliveries come because every single WhatsApp little micro business was sharing something, moving it through the groups. You have these mobile motorbikes which would come and deliver, and suddenly that business completely started to explode. So when you look at the focus, there is a greater emphasis now in every single market for us to drive digital awareness in order to foster inclusion. So here we are saying that is a reality, that is the world we live in. But the truth is, even very well-intentioned technologies can risk reinforcing what we call, and exacerbating, of course, social and economic inequality, because the power imbalances still exist. So when you look at the continent, the truth is that 96% of the 2.9 billion are still locked out of the internet in developing economies. We still know that 11% less women use the internet versus men. But also, we do know that 18% of the rural population in Africa have absolutely no access to any mobile coverage at all. So here we are saying technology is there, we're driving it, but it has this huge risk of further driving the imbalances and exclusion. So what then do we have to do? What are the factors that we need to consider in Africa and in other developing economies when we are driving inclusion? And I'll speak to them. The first is funding for digital initiatives. When we look at the startup that's happening here, those become very, very fundamental because you're starting to shift that imbalance of money, power, economics from north to south. So how do we start saying all this talent that is existing in Africa with all the digital innovations, that many of which we will also be seeing here in Luxembourg, how do we make sure they get the funding to make them win and to drive a lot more inclusion? The next point is this thing called skills development. Because again, if you don't know how to use any of these platforms, how to code, how to even use your WhatsApp and your phone, how are you going to drive the inclusion and the ability for you to become a part of this world? So when you look at initiatives that foundations such as Vodafone are doing with the instant network schools, it's one of the most powerful things because they are driving internet connectivity and content to some of the most marginalized communities. One of the most powerful, for example, I was absolutely blown away a couple of years before the pandemic hit, traveling to a refugee camp in the northern part of Kenya. Very, very dry, nothing there, and you find these young women learning how to code. Sitting there in this refugee camp, learning how to code because of the Instant Network Schools program that is driven by foundations like Vodafone in conjunction with UNCHR. Then the other thing is this access to key resource and infrastructure. A lot of work is being done by the Googles, the Microsoft, to really figure out how do we drive this infrastructure in the market so that we could drive greater access to everyone, to be able to make sure that we're not leaving people as we drive this big digital world. And then the next one is, of course, wider geographical reach. It can't only be urban areas. The mobile networks in Africa are recognizing that, yes, if indeed we're to drive bigger scale, there is a depth. You've probably covered off the whole of the urban areas. There is a very, very big need to now make sure the urban areas, every single person has that same ability to access mobile. And then finally, of course, this absolute readiness. Policies in the countries, in the environments, to make sure they're embracing these technologies, the ability to run ahead and know and anticipate that even if it's something we don't know, let's have the faith in it and make sure that we can support it because of the power that it has to drive greater inclusivity. So I would like to just chat a little bit, just talk to some of the big ones that have worked and what is working in Africa. And I'll start with, for example, FarmPass. Now, FarmPass was launched actually in 2015, and it was an initiative supported by MasterCard. And the aim was actually to bring together various agri-sectors, stakeholders, in one agricultural marketplace. So during the pandemic, farmers were able to sell their produce at 20–50% prices higher by connecting directly to the buyers and cutting out what you call the middleman. Okay? So if you look at FarmPass now, it has allowed more than 500,000 smallholder farmers across the continent access markets at a higher price. Then let me talk about the big one, the one that really changed the way mobile works, M-Pesa. And M-Pesa actually became more than a banking and a payment mobile platform or technology. It became an empowerment platform, giving those who are unable to access formal banking, the ability to bank and make payments. M-Pesa actually has created a whole plethora of businesses because suddenly, if you look at Africa, one of the biggest challenges that you have is very many people unbanked. They don't want to go to a bank. Further still, it is very difficult to access funding or finance because of the criteria, the paperwork, the requirements that you have. In fact, for a country like where I come from, Kenya, it's only until recently you'd find that even a lot of women could never ever get a loan because the collateral you needed was probably owned or held by the paternal or the male side of the society. So you as a woman, you stood little or no chance of ever walking into a bank and getting a loan. So M-Pesa has done that. Its customer base across Africa now sits at 50 million, and it is estimated that it has gotten hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty. So let's look at another sector. If you look at Dabadoc, which connects patients with doctors, another big challenge in Africa. The per capita relationship of doctor to patients is ridiculous on the continent. But suddenly now, through technology, you're able, on a platform, to connect and you get the right care wherever you sit because it has achieved this by getting over 10,000 doctors and 8 million users across the continent. This then completely shifts the way we look at healthcare and the way Africans and people who before that found it difficult to were able to do that. Then I talk about Tala, which offers, mobile loans. Little mobile loans. Because again, when you look at the continent, a lot of it is small traders. They don't want big ticket sums of money. They just want $300. The Talas of this world allow you to do that with low interest rates of 0.3% a day. And all you need, download the app, and you get going. And then the other big one, Branch, which applies machine learning and an algorithm approach in order to determine credit worthiness. Yeah, because again, that is the biggest challenge that people have. I can't borrow, what's my credit worthiness? But this now is able to do it via your customers' smartphones. So these are just some of the very few, and there are hundreds of them, digital solutions which are now available across the continent and which are all intended to increase the inclusivity at hand. So as I move, let me now talk about then where we are. What are the issues that we need to focus on in the future if we're to drive even more inclusivity across the continent? The first thing is it has to be affordable. Whatever digital access exists, it has to be affordable. One of the biggest things, across the continent they're doing is saying, yes, we're very happy. How do we bring down the costs of some of these products, these solutions, to getting them to reach more people? How do we drive the cost, for example? The biggest one is fintechs, the cost of interest, so that you're driving even further inclusivity to the market. So a huge big one there is we have to find out how that affordability, the affordability of it, and both for setting up of it and also for getting more people to be on it. The second thing, which is a big one, is that we have to find out how we make sure that a world where the majority, actually, most of businesses in Africa, more than 50% of businesses in Africa are micro, small businesses. Indeed, a lot of the business is done is what we call informal business. So then, if these are small businesses are what drive our economy, are what drives livelihoods, is where job creation is created, how do we make sure that these small businesses have indeed the ability to access the digital platforms, the funding to do that, in order to make sure that we know that? But in fact, one of the things that you find out even as we speak, in Africa, for example, where 50% of women, where women are 50% of the population, and where actually 70% of consumer spend is determined by women, you find that women indeed are now one of the biggest opportunities when it comes to small business support in these platforms in order to do that. Women are more likely than men to become entrepreneurs in Africa. They are more likely to be the bulk of the self-employed population. Yet, we know that despite this, the digital divide shrinking in the rest of the world, it is widening in Africa. So it is very, very key that in Africa we focus a lot more on this particular agenda, giving them the access, because that is where the opportunity is. That is where the number is. The pandemic actually showed us that access to technology is no longer a luxury anymore. It is a necessity, especially for girls, if we recognize that they are the ones who are the future spenders and the ones who are more likely to be the people doing the business across Africa. So that for us is a big, big space. And then the last one is really focusing on locally relevant innovation. The example that I shared, the Tala, the branch, the M-Pesa, were all driven by a really relevant need of what is happening in the continent. So tailoring solutions that positively impact and address the needs of people and communities will be absolutely key. The African youth, I believe, in particular, they lead very, very, very varied and complex lives. You have seen pictures of youth in Africa, maybe in a very dusty environment or in a very upmarket city town, but they are doing exactly the same things as a youth you'd find in New York or a youth you'd find in Beijing. So how then do we find out how we can create opportunities for these youth which will allow them to realize their potential in the circumstances and the environment that they live in. So if you look at the new industries that cropped up, particularly in urban and peri-urban areas that produced a lot of jobs and drove this inclusion, they include all these jobs under this new world called gig economy. Shared ride drivers, e-commerce and logistics. The conversation that I shared about, if you come now to my country, Nairobi, there are probably more motorbikes than there are cars. In fact, there are probably more motorbikes than there are people, because all of them are doing the business of share ride, doing the business of delivery. And the bulk of those are probably very, very young. So relevant technology is going to be very key, because it will offer scale and have that opportunity and potential to accelerate regional and international informal trade, as well as opportunities for not just the urban areas, but of course the rural areas, who are just as important and where a lot of people still live. So, in a nutshell, in the future where we live, providing adequate funding for necessary infrastructure that will facilitate digital inclusion and ensure that it is affordable and accessible to all, and fostering greater growth in the digital capacities of MSMEs, which is micro and small medium enterprises, given their expansive reach, is what is going to allow us to drive greater inclusion in our continent. So tailoring those solutions to positively impact and address needs of the people and communities, and in particular closing that digital divide between the genders, is going to be absolutely fundamental if we're going to do this and achieve the inclusivity agenda that we have to do. African governments, of course, have a huge role, and they face that dual challenge in helping shape Africa's huge economy, gig economy in particular, in order to absorb and gain the benefits of what technology and digital platforms afford, as well as at the same time making sure that they can embrace their very, very, very young populations. So I believe that in the short term, technology will create a set of new opportunities that will drive greater and more inclusivity for all. Thank you.